Thanks, Don, and thanks to all of you for joining us. I appreciate your interest in TV white spaces. I'm going to talk about fixed use of TV white spaces. These are the high power uses that Don referred to in his overview. First, a definition. A fixed device is a TV broadband device that transmits or receives radio communication signals at a specific fixed location. A couple of different uses. First, a fixed device can select channels for operation itself from a list of available channels in that geolocation database, and it can initiate and operate a network by sending enabling signals to one or more fixed devices and or personal portable TV broadband devices. And second, fixed devices may communicate directly with personal portable devices. Neeraj is going to talk more about that in his presentation. Some operating rules, very basic stuff. Power is a maximum of 4 watts EIRP. 2 metrics to keep in mind when it comes to the height of your base station. First is the base station is at a maximum of 30 meters above ground level, or roughly 100 feet. Meaning that your base station can't go above that height, and that's designed to protect broadcasters. Second requirement was not in the original rules that were released in November of 2008, but were included in the rules that were adopted in September of 2010. And that is that we now have a maximum of 76 meters above average terrain for the tower site itself. So we now have 2 metrics that you have to comply with. Number one is your tower site above or below 76 meters above the average terrain? If it's above 76 meters above average terrain, you need to find a different tower site. And second, you have the 30 meter above ground level. Your base station cannot be any more than that above ground. We've done some modeling on this, and it turns out that there are many large areas of the country, in the mountains especially, where there are rural areas and hilly areas where deployment of white spaces would be precluded. The height of the CPE, one good thing that came out of the rules adopted in September is the FCC eliminated a 10-meter minimum height above ground level requirement. That would have required that CPE be placed 30 feet or above 30 feet above ground level as a minimum height, not a maximum. And the idea behind that rule was that the devices were supposed to contain spectrum sensing technology and needed to be at a certain height in order to detect other signals that were entitled to protection. With the elimination of simultaneous spectrum, there's no need to keep that rule around. And there's also a 76-meter limit for base stations that applies to CPE as well. Channel widths, the channel widths are 6 megahertz, but they can be combined with available adjacent channels in markets where there are available adjacent channels. So channel availability, this was in Don's chart earlier, just another way to depict it. Channel 2 and channels 5 through 6 and channels 7 through 13, those are all below 216 megahertz. Channels 14 through 20, and then channels 21 through 36 and channels 38 through 51 are shared with personal portable devices. Note that channel 37 is used for other purposes, and also the first available channel next to channel 37 is reserved for wireless microphone use. A little bit about the database. First, in order to provide white space services, the channel must be available as determined by a geolocation database, and operations on that channel have to stop if the database indicates the channel is no longer available. One instance where that might occur is if a broadcast station, a TV station, changes its channels. That would change the database, and you may find that your device has to find new channels to operate on. Also, fixed TV broadband devices must avoid co-channel and first adjacent channels. We'll talk a little bit about the buffer zones on the next slide. Fixed broadband devices must access the database at least once a day to verify continuing availability of the channels. And the location of the device must be accurate to within 50 meters as determined by the database or the professional installer. So here's an a depiction of the interference protection requirements that applies to television stations. If your antenna is less than 3 meters above ground, you have to provide at least 6 kilometers of co-channel protection to a protected TV station. If it's between 3 and 10 meters, it's an 8-kilometer separation. And if it's between 100 and 30 meters, it's a 14.4-kilometer buffer zone. Other stations entitled to protection include TV translator stations, cable head ends, and other stations. So let's take into account some other technical rules. TV broadband devices must be equipped with automatic power control to limit operating power to the minimum necessary to successfully communicate. And also the devices, of course, have to incorporate some security measures to prevent the device from accessing an unapproved database, to make sure that unauthorized users can't modify the control features of the device, to ensure that devices are capable of obtaining lists of available channels only with authorized administrators of the database, and finally, to prevent corruption or unauthorized reception of the data. Finally, a few things to remember, and I'm happy to take some questions on these as we finish up. First, unless the FCC changes the rule, the height above average terrain restriction will preclude deployments in hilly areas and drive up infrastructure costs and delay service in some of those areas. If certain sites on top of mountaintops are not available, then in order to operate, a wireless ISP or other operator would need to go through the trouble of building a new site further down the mountain, meaning that they would not be able to cover both sides of the mountain. They'd have to incur additional infrastructure costs, construction costs, engineering costs, et cetera, et cetera. Also keep in mind that the propagation characteristics of the low frequencies increases the potential for interference and self-interference. This is one of the benefits as well as the detriments of white spaces, is because the propagation is so good, instead of having, you have a larger area that you're covering and the potential for interference increases. Also note that antenna sizes and propagation characteristics are going to differ across the white spaces. You'll need a different size antenna if you're operating on channel 2 than you are at channel 51. And finally, very important, the FCC does not mandate a process to coordinate or to mitigate interference among unlicensed fixed users, though the database administrators may add this feature. Keep in mind that the database exists to protect incumbent broadcast stations and other incumbents entitled to protection. It is not there to manage interference between users of unlicensed fixed white spaces and other unlicensed fixed white space users. That's an important thing to keep in mind, and I think the industry is hopeful that the database administrators will add that feature.